Good morning to those joining us in North America. Good afternoon to those joining us in Europe and across the Middle East. Thank you for being with us today. I'm Damon Wilson, Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council in Washington. And we are delighted to welcome you to our program today on renewing transatlantic strategy on Iran. Today, the Council is releasing a new report that presents recommendations for our European allies to preserve the Iran nuclear deal, to promote regional peace and development, and boost people-to-people contacts with Iran in concert with an incoming Biden administration. To kick off this event, we have a very special guest who played a leading role on Iran, Federica Mogherini, who is joining us from Belgium in her capacity now as executive board member of the European Leadership Network. We're delighted to welcome you back to the Atlantic Council platform, Madam Minister. From 2014 to 2019, Federica Mogherini, of course, served as the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and as Vice President of the European Commission. In 2015, reflecting her key role in negotiating the deal, known formally as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, she, along with Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, announced the accord to the world. Prior to her European Union role, she served as Italy's Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation in the cabinet of Prime Minister Matteo Renzi. Madam Mogherini joins us today at a critical time as international crises around the world have deepened, including over Iran's nuclear program. Of course, Iran has been a divisive issue here in the United States and one within the transatlantic alliance. The Trump administration, of course, reversed the Obama administration's support for the deal and instead pursued a maximalist pressure campaign. In turn, Tehran has stepped back from its commitment under the deal, and we now see reports of a significant surge in Iran's uranium stockpile. And Europeans have been working on how to determine how to salvage the deal. So Iran policy is an area a new U.S. administration will seek to restore cooperation with our closest traditional allies in Europe. And indeed, during the campaign, President-elect Biden committed to re-enter the nuclear deal if Iran returns to full compliance. Yet both the United States and Iran are quite focused on our own domestic politics right now, including there being a very short time prior to Iranians electing a new president. And so Europe's role in keeping diplomacy viable is central. We're looking forward to hearing Federica Mogherini's thoughts on these issues. I want to thank all of you for joining us, and our sincere thanks to Vice President Mogherini, our moderator, Borzu Duragi, who has joined us as a journalist and senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Middle Eastern programs. And he'll be joined along with our distinguished panelists and authors of the newly released report, Ellie Geranmayeh, Sahil Shah, and Barbara Slavin. So throughout this discussion, please feel free to send in your questions and comments using the Q&A function for those of you who are joining us on the Zoom platform, and engage across our social media platforms at the &AC Middle East. Send us your questions on Twitter and elsewhere. So with that, let me welcome our distinguished speaker and turn it over to you, Madam Minister. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Damon. Thanks to the Atlantic Council, to all friends and colleagues that are joining us. First of all, well, good morning to all those of you that are in the United States, across the Atlantic. Good afternoon to all our European or Middle Eastern friends. Thank you for the report. I know that not many of those that are following us might have seen it because it was released just today. But I can start by saying that it's a report that is extremely precious, extremely timely, and I think it's a great initiative to discuss it today with my fellow speakers. It is indeed a moment, I would say a moment of truth for the Iran policy, the transatlantic Iran policy. During the last 4 years, when Europeans were asked about the most dramatic divergences between the European Union positions and the Trump administration, our first thought was always going to the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear agreement. So I think that there's a lot of expectation, I'm sure there's a lot of expectation on this side of the Atlantic in Europe on a new administration focusing obviously and primarily on the domestic challenges that America is facing, starting from the sanitary, from the health crisis, the pandemic, on reuniting the country for sure, on reestablishing equality inside America, but also on somehow resetting the tone for a transatlantic partnership based on a multilateral approach. And maybe the two main pillars of that, the two most symbolic issues to which Europeans will be looking at, will be the climate change agreements and the Iran nuclear deal. As you rightly mentioned, Damon, Europeans have been focusing, I would say I've been struggling this last couple of years to avoid that the Iran nuclear deal went completely out of the radar screen or was completely destroyed. I have to tell you personally, when the announcement was made by President Trump about the US leaving the agreement, not many of us would have bet on the agreement being able to survive this stress test. And I think that if it did, even if obviously the deal is not today in the best possible shape it could have been, it is facing some challenges, and we have some non-compliance issues, definitely, yes, but still the agreement is alive. It's not in good health, but it's alive. And this is thanks to the determination and the unity, not only of Europeans, but also of the Europeans together with the rest of the international community. I have witnessed this myself. I could mention maybe only 2 or 3 countries that were not happy to help us keeping the agreement alive. And I would say that, as the report mentions, even some of these 2 or 3 countries that might have preferred to see the agreement destroyed, which fortunately did not happen, today would probably reconsider their positions and look at the possibility of reviving that kind of diplomatic track with Iran, because especially the countries in the region know very well that you cannot change geography, and Iran is never going to disappear from the map. So you have to find ways to deal diplomatically with it, which is more convenient, starting from the economic point of view, than having a conflictual approach. And I think the maximum pressure policy has shown exactly its limits. It has not brought any result that is positive, neither for the United States nor for the region. And it has increased uncertainty and security threats across the region. So I think that the assumption that that stepping out of that agreement and trying the maximum pressure approach, that way has not really delivered any positive results, including to the regional interlocutors of the United States and also of Europe. So I think that the key point now, the key point today will be, first of all, to see to what extent the new US administration will be ready and willing to re-engage on a diplomatic track, to what extent the United States will be able to rejoin fully their own compliance with the agreement, to rejoin the agreement itself. Here, the dynamics between the administration and Congress might be interesting to analyze and watch and follow. So I appreciate the focus that the report has on advising Europeans on how to bridge this gap we have now in front of us. But I think a parallel report should also be addressed maybe to Congress in the United States or to the administration in the United States on how to remobilize the US policy vis-a-vis Iran, because I think this will be quite a controversial domestic issue in the United States, if I know the United States political landscape a bit. And for sure, I guess at least it will not be just a jump in the past. It will be something new the new administration will put in place. So the question mark for Europeans will be this: how will we manage, how can we manage to reconvene somehow the parties? How can we manage to recreate an environment conducive to the results? That has been the strength, I would say, the success of the European Union role in 2015 and even before 2015 in all the negotiations, long years of negotiations that led to the agreement on the 14th of July 2015. Our strength at the time, and I can say this firsthand, was the capacity that European Union, in particular the European Union, has to have open channels with all, accommodating somehow, or at least understanding the needs, the vital needs of all parties, and trying to find a common ground that can help every player around the table, to go back home and say, I have something in this agreement that is mine. It's not 100%, but you can recognize my footprint. You can recognize my line. You can recognize my policy. And this is, I think, the trick of an agreement, having nobody fully maybe satisfied with it 100%, but everybody partially mirroring itself in the results of the agreement. And then, obviously, the delivering part. And if you look in the report, there's a very effective picture, a graph that indicates the fall, dramatic fall in the stockpiles, in the Iranian stockpiles, and now the curve is starting to regrow again. But still, the proof that the agreement has delivered stay in the fact that even now, with a partial violation, with a partial non-compliance by Iran to the agreement, in response to the stepping out of the United States from the agreement, even now, the levels are far, far lower compared to the day before the agreement. And still we have some time, I think, because Iran has always declared, and I think in good faith, that all the measures that they were retaking in non-compliance with the agreement, or in partial compliance only with the agreement, were all intended to be reversible, and that they would have reverted to full compliance in the moment when the United States would come back to the agreement and lift the sanctions, the nuclear-related sanctions that were supposed to be lifted and were lifted for some time, but too short. So I think that here now the report points out very clearly to what the challenge is in front of us now. We have just a few months between the inauguration day, 20th of January, and the presidential elections in Iran, mid of June, if I'm not wrong, around the 20th of June. How do we use those few months to make sure that the United States re-enter the agreement and Iran goes back to full compliance? It is not something that happens by a miracle all at once, overnight. It's something that requires work. It's something that needs to be prepared. It's something that needs to be discussed and agreed, and possibly the steps leading there need to be synchronized on one side, on the other, in order to avoid any perception on one side or the other that there are concessions or somehow moves that do not originate from mutual engagements and mutual commitments. I think that both Iran and the next US administration will have to feel confident and comfortable with the fact that what they are doing is not a unilateral move, but it's in the framework of a multilateral process. This is, I think, the only way. I am convinced about that. The multilateral context is the only way for Iran and the United States to engage. I don't see any possibility for a direct engagement between any kind of US leadership and any kind of Iranian leadership, simply because the history is too heavy, including the recent one. The trust is too slow. And so this multilateral framework, this context that the European Union is able to provide based on a UN Security Council resolution is the only, I think, framework that is conducive to restoring some conducive tracks of dialogue that include both Iran and the United States, and that can lead to full compliance again. And then, as the report rightly points out, from the full compliance restart, from that point onwards, there can be, I believe, further steps taken that address other issues that were not possible to be addressed, or were not even included in the horizon of the negotiations before. Many times I've been asked, wasn't it a mistake to not to include regional dynamics in the negotiations on the nuclear deal? Well, personally, I think it would have been perfectly possible to do it. It was simply never the mandate. And actually, it was even at the very origin of the negotiations, something like now 15 years ago. The mandate was strictly limited to nuclear-only issues, exactly because the Gulf region was not at the table, and they didn't want other powers to talk about regional dynamics in their absence. maybe rightly so. In any case, the scope of the negotiations and the scope of the agreement has always been purely nuclear related. This, I have to say, probably made it possible to achieve an agreement, because the nuclear-related technicalities, as many colleagues that will speak afterwards will know very well, the nuclear-related aspects and technicalities were already complicated enough to sort them out, not to mention the other issues. But for sure, there are connected elements that might need to be addressed and could be addressed once the full compliance is restored and maintained over a certain period of time. This was the intention when the agreement was signed. In the preamble of the agreement, as the report mentions, rightly so, there is a hint to the fact that the agreement, even being purely nuclear related, will constitute the basis for positive developments in the region, more cooperative approaches in the region. We simply didn't have time to do that because the agreement was signed in July 2015, entered into force completely in January 2016, and the US elections happened in November that same year. So the first 3, 4, 5 months were basically work to have the agreement consolidated and implemented at full. And then the political changes came in Washington, D.C., and it was really impossible to build on the agreement. I think that now, if we think of a positive roadmap, the steps would be this: the Europeans preparing the ground for a mutual parallel recommitment of both Iran and the United States to the full compliance to the agreement. Then this happening hopefully between January and June. And then after a certain period of time of full compliance from all sides, as the terms of the agreement always refer to, and after the Iranian presidential elections, probably a moment of further engagement at a multilateral level, also involving maybe some direct talks with some of the regional players. I think this would be more than possible and actually even desirable to see how other issues can be addressed, being it, for instance, the arms race in the region. We always refer to missiles on the Iranian side. It's not the only missiles present in the region. I think that a regional conversation about arms control could be extremely beneficial for the security of all of us, not only of the region itself, also for us Europeans for sure, but also for the United States, for Asia. It's a region that is not far away from other theaters of conflict. Think of Afghanistan or the Horn of Africa. So I think that that could be something to be discussed. Yemen, something that can be discussed. Syria is something that actually started to be discussed. I would like to maybe close on this point, and I apologize. I've taken too much time, but I could go on forever. You know, it's an issue that passionates me enormously. Actually, on Syria, the only partially successful attempt we had to solve the Syria crisis, and the last consensual UN Security Council resolution we had, was exactly after the Iran nuclear deal was signed, when for the first time the United States, together with Russia, together with the European Union and the UN, convened all regional powers for the first time ever, including Iran, to discuss possible solutions to the Syria crisis. That was the way, I think. That was the way that could have led us to find solutions, because you cannot solve a crisis without some of the players around the table. They would never have the interest in solving it. So maybe also some other parallel tracks of diplomatic efforts could be reinitiated in a fruitful manner. And I think that, Europe has a crucial role to play here. The report describes it perfectly well, because, we are the natural friends and more than allies, I say always brothers and sisters with our American friends, but we always kept a very open channel with Iran, with all the powers in the region, big or small ones. And with Iran, there is a certain element of maybe saying trust is a bit too much, but at least of confidence. We have always continued to talk, including in difficult times. We've always been candid on the disagreements. Think of human rights issues, for instance, but always very much together in the effort of preserving this common result we had achieved in 2015. So I think the European Union has a crucial role to play. I'm sure it will play it. And every time that people point out at the divisions of the European Union, I bring this as a perfect example. Not only you have full unity among European Union member states, you also have full unity with the United Kingdom. And I'm confident this will continue to be the case. So I see, for once, a positive development possible in the region, and obviously, if Washington D.C. and our European capitals, starting from Brussels, will join forces, I think there are good perspectives of reopening that positive chapter of our recent diplomatic history. So thank you again for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much, Madam Vice President. That was a very good talk. My name is Borzu Deragahi. I am an international correspondent for The Independent, the UK newspaper, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I wanted to commend the authors of this new report, Renewing Transatlantic Strategy on Iran. It looks like quite a bit of work went into it. I'll introduce the authors of the report in a moment. But first, I just wanted to give a little anecdote about an experience I had I live in Istanbul, but occasionally make it to Europe to cover various diplomatic issues, and made it to your neck of the woods, Madam Mogherini, to Brussels to discuss this very issue just before the pandemic lockdown issues struck. I was going to talk to diplomats in Brussels about the pandemic. I'm sorry, about the Iran nuclear deal and efforts to revive the Iran nuclear deal. And what was really interesting to me was, you know, in terms of everyone that I spoke to in Brussels, Iran was and the Iran nuclear deal were like number 5 or 6 on their list of concerns. Very different tone also regarding Iran when you compare it to Washington. Not an existential threat, one of numerous serious nuisances in the Middle East that includes Turkey, that includes Saudi influence, a much more measured view of Iran, and a much more, at least as far as some of the Southern European countries and France go, much more concerned about Turkey actually than Iran. And so I guess what the point that I'm trying to make is that there's a need to galvanize the Europeans on this issue as well, if any progress is going to come about, because I think that the issue of Iran, the issue of the JCPOA, even though people may give lip service to it and want to revive it, is not that high on the list of concerns for Europeans. So I would be interested, before I introduce the panel, just to ask you quickly, what do you think of that? What do you think of the need to mobilize European diplomatic bandwidth to revitalize and reinvigorate this issue, which frankly, talking to European diplomats, they're kind of tired of it. They thought that they had put this in the past, that they finished with this, they normalized things, and now this is coming up again.
You're perfectly right. Your perception was perfectly right. I think, in Europe, we have a long history of relations with Iran. I will share with you my personal anecdote. The first time I visited Iran was as a tourist many years ago. It was, another time for Iran, completely different. And when I landed from Rome with an Alitalia flight at night, the taxi driver told me, "Oh, you're Italian. You and us and the Egyptians, we are where the civilizations were born." Well, he forgot a couple of countries like China or Greece, or But in Europe, we have this awareness that Iran is not only the political or institutional or security threat or interlocutor. It's a huge country with an enormous population, well-educated, cultivated, with a complexity inside. In Europe, we've always had cultural and economic ties with Iran. So yes, the European perception is that, yes, it's one of the countries in the Middle East, sometimes extremely worrying, sometimes extremely worrying, first of all, for the human rights elements, even more than for the security threat. I would say that this is what worries us Europeans the most, probably. This is something you see also in the case of Turkey. The worries related to Turkey, the human rights violations inside the country. And then we had the nuclear issue. And yes, we saw in Europe, we saw this as a specific issue that needed to be addressed. We solved it. And then it became a controversial issue towards Washington. And it's true, there might have been a certain reluctancy on the European diplomatic side to address this very openly, because this was, every time we talked about the nuclear deal with Iran, it was an element of conflictuality with the US administration. And we didn't particularly like to be conflictual towards Washington. It's not something we enjoy, being on two different sides. So I would say that Europeans have done their homeworks, saving the agreement and preserving it for better times, and putting it in a box somehow. You know, it's not dead, it stays there. It's not going well, but it's not dead. And we will take it out of that box in the moment when we will see that conditions will be there in Washington to rework on it. But in the meantime, yes, there's Libya, there's Syria, there's Yemen, there's the Gulf tensions, there's the Palestinian issue that is still going badly. There's Turkey, there's Nagorno-Karabakh, and the list of worries for Europe is long. And I think there is yes, there is this there has been this also disillusion. 2015 was such a good moment of celebration. We were really happy of having managed to come to a conclusion of so long and difficult negotiations, and then with one single decision somewhere, this is gone. It was also a moment of disillusion for Europeans in their belief on the multilateral system. The Latin, if you allow me a Latin reference, pacta sunt servanda, you have to observe and you have to keep your promise, your pact, is a fundamental basic principle of rule of law. And Europeans took it for granted that, it's not because a CEO of a company changes that the company is not bound to the contracts he has signed. We were shocked, I think. And so, yeah, there has been probably this, okay, we do what we need to do to save it. But then we don't necessarily talk about that too much because we know it's a controversial issue, it's painful, and we'll simply look at how we can revive it when a new administration will be in place, hopefully.
Thank you so much. And with that, let me introduce our panelists, a very excellent panel of speakers. And we will, how we'll do this is we'll have, I'll introduce them, and then we'll allow each one of them to sort of talk about their contribution to this report, and then sort of open it up. And I would love to bring you, Madam Vice President, into the discussions as well. And I see from the queue of question and answer, there's a bunch of questions from the audience. I'll try to synthesize those and present them to you as well. So first off, we have here Ellie Geranmayeh. She is a scholar at the European Council on Foreign Relations. And not only is she a really accomplished scholar and academic, but she's also sort of an interlocutor. She is someone who is in touch with the diplomatic community in Europe and in touch with Iranian officials or former officials, and very closely watching the Iranian domestic scene. We have the amazing Barbara Slavin, who is someone I've known for many, many years, followed her work for even before that. She is the head of the Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council. and the Future of Iran Initiative at the Atlantic Council, as well as a very accomplished journalist, one of the top diplomatic correspondents in the field, someone I've followed for years. And we have Sahil Shah, who is not only a distinguished scholar and researcher, but also an expert on weapons of mass destruction and non-proliferation issues, has worked on these issues, not just at an academic level, but at a sort of logistical level as well. And I guess let's just start with Ellie, and I will just ask you to, describe what role you had in preparing this report and what your contribution was in this report. Thank you.
Sure, Brosru, and good morning and good afternoon to everyone. It's a hard act to follow, coming in after Minister Mogherini. As someone who was in Vienna at the time when the deal was being negotiated, I can empathize with the fact that a lot of us had high expectations for where the JCPOA may go. But I also agree that we are now in a circumstance where it's not the best case scenario by any stretch of the imagination for the nuclear deal, but neither is it the worst case scenario. And I would say that the diplomatic effort that has gone in, particularly from the E3 governments, but also from Iran, in trying to preserve the architecture of the JCPOA, has led us to the point where actually the incoming Biden administration has the option to rejoin the nuclear agreement. And my big focus for this report was trying to outline how Europeans can prepare the groundwork for Biden and his team to rejoin the agreement, and also for Iran to roll back its nuclear activities. Now, there are three main points I want to make on that front, and it's a bit more focused on where I see things going now with the Biden victory declared. So firstly, I think we have quite a delicate phase between now and January the 20th ahead of us, where Europeans are going to have to do a lot of damage limitation. We are already seeing quite concerning signs from the Trump administration and its engagement with some of its regional partners in the Middle East in terms of the signaling of possible escalation with Tehran in advance of 20th of January. And I think the Europeans need to be cautioning Iran, especially, not to fall into the traps that are being laid out at the moment by those who want to make it impossible for Biden to re-enter the nuclear agreement. A second thing that I think is very important, and we highlight it in the report, is that the E3 governments and the European Union, as parties to the nuclear deal, can do a lot between now and 20th of January to scope out the parameters for how the United States may look to rejoin the agreement, and how Iran and the US can work together under the umbrella of the Joint Commission to come back into full compliance with the agreement. And I think it's particularly important now at this stage to get some public statements from the European governments welcoming a Biden administration back to the nuclear deal and signaling that that is the preferred European positioning for working on transatlantic cooperation on Iran policy. There's also an important role that the Europeans can start to play with members of Congress, even from now. Those who have been elected, particularly to the Senate, will play an important role in setting the political environment for Biden's approach towards Iran. And I think here from Europeans in Washington and those in European capitals in favor of Biden rejoining the JCPOA will be quite important. Then there's the second phase of January 20th and onwards. And I think at that moment, if we have a JCPOA architecture in place, which thankfully it looks like we will have, and we are able to have a period of calm between Iran and the United States in the region, I think that the Europeans should move quickly in trying to push Iran to quickly freeze its nuclear agreements in return for certain economic rewards. And this is outlined in the paper as one of the ways that the Europeans should be pushing both sides back to the nuclear agreement. And working really on the technical roadmap for both sanctions easing and also Iran's nuclear rollback through the months ahead. And I think finally, in parallel, while the US is very much caught up in both domestic issues and other priority areas of foreign policy, one thing that the EU High Representative in particular can be doing is looking at a regional track in parallel to the nuclear talks, where key stakeholders in the region are brought together for a degree of regional dialogue. And that's another area that is highlighted in the paper. I'll end with saying that one of the issues we emphasize in the paper is that the window of opportunity really should not be missed, either by the Europeans or Iran or the incoming Biden administration. We've already seen Iran's nuclear program expanding, and there are multiple reports now indicating further expansion. And Iran is unlikely to stop its nuclear activities until and unless they get a positive signal from the United States that there is sanctions relief on the horizon. Secondly, this expanding nuclear program will likely have a degree of regional fallout that will undermine both European and US security interests for stability in the region. So the longer we put off that track of dialogue with Iran on the JCPOA, I think the higher risks of fallout on the regional playing field. And finally, we shouldn't miss the political window. As was mentioned before, we're coming close to Iranian presidential elections in June. And so that means the period between February and June is going to be key for engaging the current Rouhani administration on delivering on the JCPOA implementation. And coincidentally, that same window is a time where the Biden administration will have the greatest political momentum to deliver on some sort of a diplomatic outreach with Iran. So really, the time is of the essence to get the political track going. And I think now is the time for the Europeans to bring their JCPOA efforts out of that box that was just mentioned and really proactively push ahead. Thank you, Borzu.
And with that, I turn attention now to Barbara Slavin. If you would like to just, what would be the Washington focus of this report? I guess that would be your specialty.
Well, first, thank you, Borza. Thank you, Madam Mogherini. It's a real pleasure to have you. And to my wonderful co-authors and co-panelists, this report was something that I pushed, frankly, as something that was a kind of no-brainer for the Atlantic Council, which of course focuses on transatlantic cooperation. And it's been painful to see the divisions between the United States and Europe over the last 3.5, 4 years on Iran as on many other issues. You know, I'm old enough to remember writing about how the Europeans have stepped in repeatedly to talk to Iran over the past 30, 40 years, actually, when the United States wouldn't, or when Iran was not willing to talk to the United States. And if not for the efforts of Jack Straw, Joschka Fischer, Dominique de Villepin, as well as Javier Solana and their successors, including Madame Mogherini, Iran's nuclear program would have advanced even more quickly than it did. So we now have the incoming Biden administration, and I know for sure from my contacts with members of the transition that the US is looking to coordinate Iran policy again with its closest allies in Europe. And I think what Ellie said was very important about how Europe can begin to help sequence steps back to mutual compliance. And as we write in our issue brief, we should see instruments like INSTEX utilized to boost humanitarian trade with Iran, especially during this pandemic, when Iran is suffering so much and has such a high level of cases. In addition to that, you know, I think that the Biden administration will also revive a back channel with Iran at some point once it is in office. And I think we're very lucky if you, like others, have looked through the lists for these agency review teams that the Biden administration has announced. You will see a lot of familiar names, a lot of familiar faces, individuals with prior experience under the Obama administration dealing with Iran. And I'll just mention a few of them: Colin Kahl, Puneet Talwar, Jeff Prescott, Peter Harrell, and Elizabeth Rosenberg, among many others who worked on the National Security Council, who worked in Joe Biden's office, who worked at the State Department, who worked on sanctions, who worked at the Treasury Department. And many of us, and the idea for this report really came out of a number of brainstorming sessions that we at the Atlantic Council and other think tanks like the Center for New American Security and others have been holding over the last couple of years, really, looking to the possibility of getting a new and reinvigorated kind of diplomacy with Iran. Noting that even if it had been Donald Trump again, in a second term, he would have needed a new policy because, as Federica Mogherini pointed out, the maximum pressure campaign has not worked. It really has backfired. I should mention also Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, and Bill Burns, who, Bill Burns is my personal hope for Secretary of State, but perhaps Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan seems to be working a little bit on domestic affairs these days, but he also was part of the back channel with the Iranians in Oman that helped get the JCPOA. One other thing, I'm going to leave it to Sahil to talk about some of the non-proliferation aspects that we would like to see become regionalized, perhaps in a JCPOA 2.0, but I wanted to mention the section at the end on support for civil society and people-to-people engagement. This is a particular issue for me, something that has been very close to my heart as someone who has had the rare opportunity as an American to go to Iran 9 times. And I know that one of the things that Joe Biden is going to do on day one is to end the Muslim ban, the travel ban that has kept so many Iranians from coming to the United States. It is my hope that Iran will show goodwill in return and that we will see a very early release of dual nationals, including Americans, who are being held unjustly in Iran. There are many of them. I will mention Siamak Namazi, but there are also French and British and German and other dual nationals who really should be released now, but certainly as part of a goodwill gesture going forward. And I would like to see a resumption of academic engagement. I'd like to see us work with the Iranians on COVID, on climate, and so many other issues. We had started this process frankly, right after the JCPOA was reached and even before, and it's something that we really need to revive again. So why don't I leave it there and again, thank my co-authors and co-panelists.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I will turn now to Sahil. And one of the questions that came in, and it was sort of alluded to in Barbara's comments, and perhaps you can weave this into your commentary now, is what should a new agreement with Iran look like? I mean, in terms of, people have said that it's unrealistic to talk about Iran's regional role and missile proliferation and so on, but perhaps there are some technical dimensions that could be adjusted, not necessarily to Iran's detriment or to the United States' advantage, but perhaps there are some non-proliferation matters, question marks that could be ironed out in a, let's not call it JCPO 2, but let's call it JCPOA 1.1.
Thank you. Thank you to Damon and to Borzo for introducing us, and Federica for the great opening comments, and last but not least, Ellie and Barbara especially for inviting us to write the paper with you, and also all the fabulous people who red teamed the report who are acknowledged in the acknowledgements at the end of the paper. Just because I know we're limited on time, I'm just going to make five brief points. I think the first is that I think we all need to make sure that we keep in mind that the last 4 years did happen and nothing's going to erase this fact. The whole psychological basis on which the deal was constructed isn't the reality right now. Prior to Trump, the issue of trust was over Iran's non-compliance, hence why we ended up with such a robust verification regime that Iran continues to respect, sort of an additional protocol plus model. But now US credibility has taken a giant shot, and with European appeasement along the way over the past 4 years, we've seen European credibility also take a shot. Post-Trump, we've always known that the way forward would have to be rebalanced to fill this void. So it shouldn't be a surprise, when we're hearing currently from Iranian interlocutors publicly and privately that proposals for saving the JCPOA has to recognize this imbalance of responsibility. The JCPOA is a sacrificial lamb for much bigger debates and tides that have been taking place in Europe and across the world. And, in turn, Iran isn't going to bilaterally negotiate with the US. So the Europeans need to respect and value the strategic patience exhibited and speak up. Luckily, Europeans are well on it, I believe. They are finding ways to try to convene the Joint Commission sometime soon. But I think at the end of the day, what we have to realize is that the E3 and European intervention can't be just focused on Iran and the subsequent non-compliance or lack of implementation. It's done in parallel in response to the US. It has to be also geared towards the United States, trying to urge Biden into as much of an accommodating position as possible. And if we all recognize what a staunch transatlanticist President-elect Biden is, this should be done in that context. Just third, Iran has already said that there needs to be negotiations on the conditions upon which the US re-enters the JCPOA. There's issues over sanctions relief, compensation, the snapback measure, and how the United States tried to unilaterally impose it, as well as the messy situation with the dispute resolution mechanism that seemingly everybody that was in the JCPOA triggered at some point this year. But Iran also accepts that they need to work with everyone to get under some of those technical limits. Iran's under the heavy water limits, but for example, with the low enriched uranium, they'll need the United States to move on certain sanctions waivers in order to get that out and exported. And also that research and development, you can't put back into scientists' heads. So this is an area in which Iran recognizes that, we may be able to try to move certain aspects of the agreement. Just two quick last points to answer your question, Borzo, and also to cement something that I find also really important that Barbara raised. First is that Ellie very aptly tweeted today, don't expect Iran's nuclear activities to slow down till there is a clear pathway in place for Biden's administration to ease sanctions. Tehran consistently underscored it's prepared to reverse expanded nuclear steps if the economic part of the bargain is delivered. I would just like to add to that, it's the same thing with Iran's regional activities as well. In terms of missiles, we're seeing chatter lately, but Iran is one of 11 countries with long-range systems in the region. And I think that moving forward through European initiatives, such as a German Missile Dialogue Initiative and other Track 1 and Track 1.5 initiatives, we'll see some progress there. But this is not something to try to include now. We must focus on the nuclear question. And last but not least, the economic bargain should be seen as separate from the humanitarian one. COVID is still raging. And if Vice President and President-elects Harris and Biden are serious about restoring the soul of the nation, this also extends to American empathy abroad. There's a number of asks Europeans have been making. There's a number of asks that they can make. And it's great to see that INSTEX, STHA, and other mechanisms maybe have a chance to survive, but we need the clarity and guidance from the administration very early on to get that done. So I'll end there. Thank you.
Great, thank you all. That was wonderful. I guess we have some really good questions here from the audience, and I'll some intelligent, constructive questions, and I'll present some of them to you, sometimes sort of synthesizing them together. But I guess one interesting question, just to start it off, I thought maybe because I'm a journalist, I thought it was a good way of starting this as sort of an empirical question to you, Madam Vice Minister Mogherini. What concrete steps have the E3 countries undertaken over the last 2 years to keep the JCPOA alive? Is there a list? Is there a sort of list of accomplishments that they can point to in terms of getting the Iranians convinced that the Europeans are an honest interlocutor?
Yes, I think the Iranians know that very well. I think that, as Sahil said, now the question mark is on the reliability of the United States side. But I think the Iranians know very well, not only the leadership, but also the population, that Europe can be complicated, can be cumbersome, can come with a lot of conditionalities, including and starting with human rights. Sorry if I go back to that, but I think it's a very important point. But you know what you get. It's predictable, it's transparent, it's reliable. I don't think Iranians have questioned this, but they do with the United States, and even more so now. Yes, the European Union member states, European Union as such, not only the three, have done a lot of things in these last 2 years. First of all, the simple fact of stating that we were fully sticking to the compliance and we're inviting everybody to be compliant to the agreement, well, it was not a self-evident move in the moment when Trump announced that the United States were stepping out. Many were betting on Europeans to either get divided on that or simply follow the US administration line. We didn't. And I think that the repeated and constant message was the starting point for saving the agreement, saying the agreement is there, we're going to stick to it, stick to this also you Iran, you Russia, you China, you the rest of the world. So this is the first, the political consistency. And then the economic measures, the humanitarian measures, the diplomatic channels. Well, one of the last visits that my successor, Josep Borrell, managed to do before COVID came was to Iran to meet his counterpart Zarif there. So the commitment has been there. There has been a lot of complicated negotiations and difficulties in establishing INSTEX, an extremely difficult exercise because you realize how much the financial and economic European system is linked to the American one. But also a very instructive, I would say, exercise for Europeans that have realized how much we need a certain level of autonomy to be able to play our global role. I think overall, if we manage to get to this point where it is still possible to discuss about how the United States can rejoin the agreement, it's thanks to the fact that Europeans were stubborn, I would say, and quite courageous in these last 2 years on this point. If I can comment on one point that was raised during the panel and that I find very important is this. I think I know our Iranian interlocutors quite well by now. I spent with them a lot of time, and I think we reached the level of understanding, even if sometimes disagreements, but understanding that is very profound. And I can say I'm 100% sure there is no way in which any Iranian leadership can engage in a new negotiation of a new agreement unless the JCPOA is first fully implemented on all sides. I think this was always clear. We have seen recent attempts, even from European sides, to initiate something else, something more. I think there's no way for the Iranian psychology, no way they can move on the next step unless the JCPOA is fully restored, fully implemented from all sides, and for a certain period of time. I think that then it is possible to build on it and explore further chapters, further steps, further versions, new elements that can be discussed. But I don't see the possibility of moving on new elements unless and until the existing agreement is fully implemented by all sides. I think this is the starting point, and I think we would be mistaken and under a very serious illusion if we were thinking of doing the other way around. First, you negotiate another agreement, and then you see how to join the old one. No, it doesn't. It would never work that way. So first, you need to come back to the agreement. Agree the sequencing, as Alice was saying, the sequencing of how to recommit fully and re-implement fully from all sides. And then once you have established that and you have restored some elements of trust, including in the US administration from the Iranian side, but also from the European side, because also Europeans were a bit annoyed by the fact that we were left alone by the United States in this. Once the trust is restored and once the implementation is restored, then you can possibly negotiate further steps.
Thank you so much. The next question, I would like Barbara to start with the answer. It's a synthesis of several questions we have from the audience about the mechanics of rejoining the JCPOA on the part of the US. What can be done? One participant in this discussion mentioned Zarif talking about 3 executive orders, which could resume US participation in the JCPOA. Is it a matter of removing all sanctions with regard to just the nuclear issue, the other issues in terms of terrorism and militant groups and human rights? How would that work, and what would be the steps of, this is a big question, of unraveling the layers of sanctions that have been imposed by the Trump administration?
It's a terrific question. Let me add first to Madame Mogherini's list of things that the Europeans did. They shot down Snapback, that attempt by the US, and I thought that was brilliant, and it was brilliantly handled. So let me just add that to the list. In terms of what the US can do, you know, the Biden administration has put out a list of things it intends to do on day one of the Biden administration. They haven't said rejoin the JCPOA, but they could, indeed. All of these sanctions that have been dumped on Iran over the last couple of years, even the ones that have been categorized as related to terrorism or other issues, could be considered nuclear related because they all come in the context of the United States quitting the JCPOA unilaterally when Iran was in compliance. So if Joe Biden wants to, he can simply say all these sanctions are nuclear related. They're all put through with executive orders, none of them through congressional legislation, and they can simply be lifted by executive orders. I'm not familiar with the exact 3 that Javad Zarif mentioned, but I'm sure he will be happy to enlighten us what they are. And I also wanted to just second what Madame Mogherini said about the need to rejoin the existing agreement. We're hearing so much chatter in Washington from certain quarters, you know which ones they are, that, oh no, we have leverage now, we can get more. Well, ultimately, perhaps we can get more for more. But initially, I think, you know, it's absolutely correct that we have to start by going back to where we were. And remember that under the JCPOA, Iran cannot have enough fissile material for more than one nuclear, you know, for even close to enough for a nuclear weapon until the year 2030, actually till January 2031. That's a whole decade in which to talk about a JCPOA 2.0.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that topic?
Sure, Bruce. I can just add 1 cent to that. On the sanctions easing front, I do think there will need to be a degree of discussion, both within the Joint Commission and on a bilateral level between Iran and the US, on how the sanctions easing process will work, the timing of that and the extent of that. While a lot of the sanctions under the nuclear ban certainly can be lifted quite easily by the Biden administration with enough political will, I think there will be some disagreements, even among Democrats, about the extent to which they will want to roll back human rights related and terrorism related sanctions that have been imposed under the Trump administration since leaving the nuclear deal in May 2018. And here, one idea to accommodate all needs is perhaps initially to begin with the Biden administration easing sanctions that are most systematic to Iran's economic needs. So for example, the terrorism designation that was placed on the Central Bank of Iran will be systematic to its economic needs and critical in terms of re-implementing the deal on the part of the United States. There will be much more questions, however, over whether Biden can and should roll back the foreign terrorist organization designation against the IRGC that was brought in under the Trump administration. But there's arguably less of an impact on Iran's economic economic needs from that angle. So I think there will be a process of discussions on the package of sanctions easing that will be provided by a Biden administration.
Borzoi, could I just add quickly also that the sanctions put on Javad Zarif and on Ali Salehi, those should also be removed immediately.
Great. I have a synthesis of a bunch of questions and comments that I'll put to Sahil. Let's say that Biden buckles to the sort of same crowd in Washington that Trump has been listening to, decides on January 20th to pay lip service to rejoining the JCPOA. If this basically a disingenuous attempt to appear to be willing to join the JCPOA, but not rejoin the JCPOA. And it says, we don't really care, and goes on with continuing the maximum pressure by another name, which is not out of the realm of possibility, given what the politics of Iran are in Washington. So what? What does that mean for the global non-proliferation framework? Iran is a rogue state with horrendous human rights violations and is a detriment to the region. Let them suffer a little bit more. Maybe the argument will go, and let them come back to us on their knees in a year or two. Why is that not a good policy, or is that maybe a feasible policy, Sahil?
Thank you for the question. I think that it's important to discuss the JCPOA in the context of the wider debates and tides in Europe and what that means for the transatlantic relationship, but also the global non-proliferation regime. This year is the 50th anniversary of the NPT. We have bought ourselves a few months with COVID, with the postponement of the review conference for the NPT until August. And I think that it's going to be incredibly important that the Biden administration is able to make positive signals and concrete commitments to not just the JCPOA, but also the CTBT, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the NPT at large, also engaging very substantially in the P5 process, under which there might be some improvements in strategic stability. And I think the main cornerstone for all of this, and one of the main opportunities, will be when the US and Russia hopefully extend the New START agreement on the first day. Just a little over 2 weeks after inauguration, will be left for that extension protocol, perhaps maybe even with provisional application being needed to be put through. I think that provides a really good basis, especially for the US and Russia, to continue cooperation in the non-proliferation field, and the JCPOA should be part of that. The other thing is that the US doesn't just have a responsibility to the non-proliferation architecture, it has a responsibility to its friends and allies in Europe. And Biden has continually said, as has many members of his team, how they want to get transatlantic policy, especially security policy, back on track. So the JCPOA, climate change, the Paris Peace Accords, all of this has to, Paris Climate Accords, all is part and parcel of this larger picture, and positive movement has to be made, and I think that we all expect it to be.
Barbara, I would like you to, if you could, weigh in on that as well. So what? What is the damage to the U.S. And to global security if this deal just continues on some form of life support that amounts to its de facto, if not formal, death?
Well, look, I think we've been very lucky that the JCPOA, is still alive, albeit in somewhat zombie-like state, and I credit the Europeans and the Iranians for that, frankly. But let's remember that, there are people in Iran who may say, to hell with this at some point, and leave the NPT and actually go for a nuclear weapon the way the North Koreans did, back in 2002, 2003. So I don't think we can just take this situation for granted. I think it's dangerous. And anybody who's been reading the newspaper here lately knows that apparently President Trump, so frustrated by the fact that maximum pressure has been a maximum bust, actually asked for options on bombing Iran the other week. So this is the Middle East. Things can always get worse. And we simply cannot allow this situation to continue to deteriorate.
Barbara, since you're still on, let me just ask you real quick, because we have a number of questions about this topic. What are you hearing about that, about the possibility of an attack between now and January 20th? I've spoken to people who said that the Middle East and both the Middle East and Europe were swirling with rumors last week of something coming up, something bad coming up, something militaristic or clandestine or overt or covert or something. Is there any buzz that you're hearing, and what are the chances that that a Trump administration unplugged and unconcerned about re-election, and perhaps more and more unconcerned about its legacy even, would launch some sort of attack?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think we can rule it out. I would point out that Secretary of State Pompeo is in Israel again. And of course, Bibi Netanyahu may see the next 2 months as his last window for something rather dramatic against Iran. We've already seen a lot of cyber attacks, mysterious explosions. Not so long ago, we have some tension again in Iraq. So, I wouldn't rule it out. I hope that is not the direction that we go in. I mean, on the other side, of course, we have the fact that Donald Trump promised his base that he would not get the United States into yet another Middle Eastern war, and the Pentagon has announced a reduction of forces in both Afghanistan and Iraq. So hopefully this is the trend line, more toward withdrawal than not. But the idea of a dramatic strike or attack, at the same time the U.S. is withdrawing troops, that could work for Donald Trump. That's something that he could definitely process. Let me just say, though, if the U.S. bombs, or if Israel bombs Natanz, there's going to be radiation. There's going to be a lot of innocent deaths. This is not a surgical strike. There's also Fordo. And I have tweeted that if the US or Israel attacks Iran's nuclear installations, this would be the one thing that would really incentivize Iran to develop nuclear weapons. So I hope cooler heads will prevail, both in Washington and also in Jerusalem/Tel Aviv.
I guess this would be a question for anyone, but I'll ask Sahil and Ellie if they wanted to comment on this. What about China and Russia? They are parties to the deal as well. The Iranians are interesting in that they don't complain so much about China and Russia and their non-compliance with the deal, even though there was many months where the sales of oil, Iranian oil to China had plummeted. Now they're going back up. And Russia doesn't really support the Iranian economy, though it provides them diplomatic cover at the UN Security Council. What role do they have in this tangled affair? How can they help or hurt? And what are the stakes for China and Russia in the preservation or allowing in the preservation of the JCPOA?
I'm happy to go first. I think that it's been extremely interesting, the discourse surrounding Russia and China and what they've done to support Iran during this period. But the reality is that Russia's only sold one air defense system to Iran. China hasn't really been that successful at investments in terms of Iran's oil fields or its ports. China has earmarked approximately 400 billion in investments to upgrade those industries. But where does that number come from, and how is it being operationalized? Borsen Bazar, namely our friend Esfandiar Batmangalic, has done a lot of empirical analysis on this. And I think it's important that that economic bargain that underpins the JCPOA is implemented by not just Europeans, aided by more clarity and support from the US, but also the Russians and the Chinese. Moreover, the JCPOA is also a global security agreement. it is dialogic with the NPT, it's dialogic with global peace and security, and therefore there's a number of traditional trading partners that Iran has as well, India, South Korea, Turkey, that also need to step in and fill the void. And I think that Russia and China need to put their money where their mouth is, because I think that they're gotten away with putting the responsibility, quite frankly, too squarely on Europeans, where opportunities, quite honestly, in the past 4 years for them to have delivered more on trade with Iran. So thank you for that question.
Ellie, I would love to hear your thoughts on that as well, if you care to weigh in.
Sure. Look, I think there's a number of things going on. You mentioned the political cover that Russia and China have given to Iran for the last few decades. I think that's certainly one part. We shouldn't forget the security relationship that Iran has in particular with Russia when it comes to conflict theaters like Syria, but also in terms of Iran's ambitions to expand its conventional military arms supply through Russia and China. So I think that's another factor that's on their mind in terms of their positioning publicly with both countries. There's also the fact that Russia and China had different, and I would say less demands vis-a-vis Iran's nuclear activities than Europe and the US had. And so this naturally, I think, brought with it a higher expectation from Iran in terms of who would provide the economic part of this JCPOA bargain. I would say finally, though, there are a number of senior figures within the Iranian political establishment and have for a very long time pushed for a quote unquote strategic alliance between Iran and its Eastern partners, Russia and China. And I think the experience of the shortfall in Russia and China delivering economically to Iran under the recent Trump era sanctions has been a sort of wake-up call for the entire establishment that actually they do need a more balanced approach between the West and the East. And in some ways that may be beneficial for Iran in the long term.
Great, thank you so much for keeping your answers so succinct and useful. I guess Vice President Mogherini, I would like to put a version of that question to you. If you could just sort of, because Japan and South Korea and some of these very important Asian countries, I mean, they're involved in this equation as well. They're big purchasers of Iranian oil. They also seem to get off scot-free in terms of not investing diplomatic bandwidth in keeping this deal, which maintained or at least sought to maintain some semblance of stability in an area that is of strategic importance to them. Is there a role for them to play? In your role as foreign policy chief for the EU, how closely did you communicate with the Asian nations? Very interested to hear that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because it's true. Iran not only has ties or hopes to have ties with Russia and China, but also with many others. You mentioned South Korea, you mentioned Japan. I would add India, Australia, New Zealand. You have the Asia Pacific region that is quite a relevant one for the Iranian economy. This is why during these last couple of years, we have kept always first me and then Borrell, constant contacts and open channels at our level, so ministerial level and sometimes even presidential level with those countries. I cannot remember of any bilateral we had with any of our partners in Asia and in the Pacific region, but also in Africa. And in Latin America, I cannot think of any of these bilaterals where we didn't address at a certain moment the JCPOA file, and where the European Union High Representative was not briefing our partners and interlocutors on the good reasons to stick to it and the good reasons to continue to make sure that Iran could benefit from the legitimate revenues that it could have. And I have to say, I mentioned this in the beginning, apart from 1 or 2 countries in the region, and I literally mentioned 1 or 2, not more, all the others have always been extremely dedicated and constructive in trying to help keeping the agreement in place under very difficult circumstances, because the pressure from Washington was quite severe, not only on Europeans, but also on the Asian Pacific partners. Obviously, some of this has happened, some of this has not really happened, but has been tried. Some of these countries have also tried to play a diplomatic role, and it has been always in coordination with the European Union. It has been helpful. I think that now everybody is looking at the developments on Washington, D.C. side. And as Sahil was mentioning before, I would like to underline this. It is extremely important test for the incoming administration, not only on the Middle East policy. It's not just a foreign policy issue, it's a nuclear non-proliferation issue. The Obama administration had a lot of work done on non-proliferation issues. Some of the very symbolic speeches by the president were dedicated to this. Biden was part of that administration. Barbara mentioned, I think also the New START treaty, the CTBT, the NPT. There's a non-proliferation agenda coming up for the US also. So it's a test on the Middle East policy. It's a test on the transatlantic policy. How close will the new administration will be able to work again with the Europeans? And Europeans were always very clear, this is a must for us, working on the JCPOA restored and the climate change Paris Agreement. How much will the new administration be able to rejoin the multilateral context, the approach of multilateralism? Never forget, the JCPOA is a UN Security Council resolution unanimously adopted. So formally, literally, the United States are at the moment contravening the one of the UN Security Council resolutions that wasn't voted by the United States themselves. So it's not just an Iran policy. It's an Iran, Middle East, non-proliferation, multilateral policy, and transatlantic one. So the test is done on one agreement, but on many different layers. You tick many different boxes by one move. This is why I think it's going to be very strategically very important, the decisions to be taken. And I'm sure that Europeans will be there to accompany this process that would not be easy, probably, but possible. If we manage to achieve the agreement in the first place, and then to have it implemented, and then even to save it, and still today with the non-compliance being in a better place than the day before the agreement was reached, I think definitely will be possible to have full implementation again in the next 6 months.
I guess we should also just talk a little bit about the 1-year anniversary of the crushing of popular protests in Iran and the Iranian human rights record. Now, I'm always very, very cautious about this because I sometimes worry that Western governments, especially the US, use the human rights issue, instrumentalize it as a cudgel against regimes they don't like, while ignoring the abuses of countries they do like. But I guess we should sort of try to examine ways in which engagement with Iran and engagement in the next few months possibly could reinvigorate this debate in a constructive way. Is there a way of using the potential opening that's coming in the next few months to open a dialogue with Iran on human rights, encourage, usually in the weeks, as Ellie knows before, and Barbara very well knows, in the weeks before an Iranian elections, the political space opens up and things that were taboo in the newspapers and on TV all of a sudden become, you can talk about them and you can discuss them. I guess I would just like to explore, maybe with Barbara and Ellie, is there an opportunity to reopen that channel?
That's such a great question. I think one of the great frustrations of the Trump administration leaving the JCPOA is that we had to talk about nuclear issues again. The first issue brief we did at the Atlantic Council after the JCPOA was implemented was about how to promote human rights in Iran in a constructive manner. Here, I think, again, we work with the Europeans, we work with multilateral organizations, we work with the Special Rapporteur on Iran human rights that the United Nations has established. We don't just beat Iranians over the head bilaterally. We don't put out propaganda tweets and this week in Iran bashing comments from the State Department. We do it in a less propagandistic way. We also, and this I'm very sure we will see from the Biden administration, we don't have egregious double standards. So when we're criticizing Iran for its human rights abuses, we also are criticizing other countries, including countries that have been our friends, like Saudi Arabia, like Israel. We don't make this just an Iran conversation. But yes, we should bring it in. Absolutely. It should always be part of our discourse with Iran.
I can just add some points from another angle in that, watching also what's happened inside Iran under the last 4 years in the Trump era, and particularly in terms of the repercussions of the maximum pressure sanctions campaign. Let's not forget that the biggest hit has been felt by ordinary Iranian people on the ground. That, from daily conversations are struggling with finding medicines and access to healthcare is being increasingly restricted during the pandemic. So while there have been incredible amounts of frustration at the mismanagement and mishandling by authorities, the focus inside Iran has shifted away from that political human rights discourse that was being had to focusing on making ends meet. And I think this has been one of the real negative consequences of this exclusive maximum pressure campaign that the US has led, that has basically marginalized the discourse on human rights, because there are frankly bread and butter priorities out there for various people across different political opinions in the country.
Great, and just reflecting some of the questions here from the audience, really smart questions too. But what about this talk of reparations, compensation that Zarif has been talking about and some Iranian officials have been discussing? Iran's economy has been, badly, brutally damaged, its civilian economy over the last few years. Much of that is because of the pandemic and Iran's botched handling of the pandemic. There are, big structural deficiencies and so on. I would think that for many Western policymakers, cash handouts to Iran would be a non-starter. But are there other mechanisms? Are there European or even international development funds that could be provided to Iran as an incentive to come back to the deal in a sort of as a responsible incentive to come back to the deal and reduce its nuclear stockpile and its centrifuge production? I'll put that to whoever wants to answer it.
If I may, and Borzai, as much as I'm enjoying this discussion, I have to tell you that we're already multiple minutes over our limits. So maybe this should be the last question or just one more. One of the things we recommend in our issue brief, and many others have recommended this as well, is that the first thing we do, the Biden administration signals that they are perfectly happy to let the emergency loan that Iran asked for from the IMF, I believe it was for $5 billion for COVID relief, that Iran should get that immediately. and Iran certainly needs it, and the United States doesn't have to vote for it, but it can give tacit approval.
Just to add to that, I just want to say that, the IMF estimates that Iran has ready access to just around 10% of its foreign reserves. And, Iranians have shown that they're willing to have some of these foreign reserves specifically be used for humanitarian trade. And Iran should have access to that money to be able to buy the goods and the medicine that they need. But there's urgent clarity that's needed for mechanisms like INSTEX and SHTA. And next month at this time on December 16th, we'll be convening a conversation with the chairman of INSTEX, and hopefully there can be some positive dialogue there. But I think, again, the humanitarian offering should be separate from all of this. It's really important that we get it right. And there's been a lot of ideas put forward in the paper and by all of our organizations represented here on how to get that done rather quickly.
If I can add to that, I think it's very important to have the humanitarian channel delivering immediately because the humanitarian aid doesn't have any kind of political considerations attached. This is a basic humanitarian principle that I hope the United States will go back to valuing as much as we Europeans do. But then that doesn't solve the problem. The main problem is how to revitalize the Iranian economy in the long term in a structural manner. And here we started to have work done, including on reforms on the Iranian side. Everything was stopped in the moment when, for instance, European banks and European businesses were clearly said from Washington, don't do that, don't even touch anything that relates to Iran. And any bank or business in Europe that also has a portfolio or a business in the United States thought twice before doing that. So I would say what needs to be done on the economic side is the full compliance to the JCPOA provisions, the lifting of the sanctions that are related to nuclear issues. And I fully agree with Barbara, this doesn't mean in any way being complacent on human rights. The European Union has kept even stronger sanctions on Iran on all human rights related issues, but we lifted all the nuclear related ones. You have to make the difference and be merit-based in your choices. Again, I think that the way forward for also bringing back Iran to full compliance is the full compliance on the American side and consequently also on the European private sector side on the economic investments, on the trade relations. Many projects were already on the way and stopped after Trump stepped out of the agreement. We need a green light again that the European private sector can re-engage with Iran, not only through the instruments that the Europeans have managed finally to put in place, like INSTEX, which is a difficult instrument to use, but most of all, without being punished by the US side for doing that. That would be enough. That would be enough.
Thank you so much. That's about it in terms of time. Thank you, Ellie Geranmayeh. Thank you, Barbara Slavin. Thank you, Sahil Shah. And thank you so much, Federica Mogherini. It's been such a pleasure to have you all. I thought this was a very constructive and interesting discussion with different points of view presented. Thank you so much. Have a great week to everybody else.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so